Hello everybody, this is a lecture on factorial designs. What's a factor? A factor is an independent or predictor variable. So something that we're curious about the impact on a dependent variable. So a factor is an IV or a PV. Factorial designs are when we have two or more of those. And so it could be two IVs or two PVs or one IV and one PV or more. So it's a combination of those two. The only difference between an IV and a PV is that IV is manipulated, the PV is not manipulated, predictor variable. But both of them are things that we look at in terms of their impact on the dependent variable. So factorial designs is when there's two or more IVs/PVs. And typically people do these types of studies when they're curious about interactions. Interactions are when the impact on the DV depends on the levels of both the variables together. We'll go in more details about this later, but basically an interaction is when the answer about does X affect Y, the answer is yes, it does, but it depends on the level of Z, the other variable. So there's some examples here. This is from the book, The Combined Effects on Intergroup Contact and Need for Closure on Prejudice. I don't think they described the study, they just had this title. So here, prejudice is the dependent variable. And then one of the variables that they're looking at in terms of the impact on the DV prejudice is intergroup contact. Intergroup contact is when there is contact between groups. Whatever they're studying in terms of prejudice, prejudice can occur obviously between various types of groups. So intergroup contact just says that how much does that person interact on a daily basis with people from that other group, whether that other group is a gender group or gender identity group or a racial group or ethnic group, or is could be a political group even. There's all sorts of prejudice that can occur. So whatever the groups are, so intergroup contact means that you are interacting with the other group that the person is studying in terms of if you're prejudiced against that group or not. And I don't know from this title whether it's an IV or PV. It could be an IV. You could set up and manipulate situations where people interact with other people from other groups and then see the impact on prejudice from that manipulation. Or it could be a PV if they're just studying how much people have intergroup contact just in general in their lives. And then the other variable is need for closure. I'd say that need for closure in this case is almost definitely a predictor variable. Need for closure is a commonly used personality variable. And need for closure are basically, if you're high on need for closure, you're somebody that there has to be definite answers. It has to be yes or no. It has to be right or wrong. There has to be some clear path and answers, and you want to be told what to do, what to think. Somebody has to tell you the exact steps to take. Where high need for closure is people who are more loose. They're fine with ambiguity. They don't have to be told that something is right or wrong. They understand that the world is fuzzy. And so that's typically a personality variable. And people who are high on need for closure tend to be more prejudiced because they tend to think in very rigid ways. So people are right or wrong, people are good or bad. And so these types of rigid thinking patterns that is captured by need for closure is related to prejudice. So here, this is saying that these two variables interact together to influence prejudice. So I would guess that people who are low on need for closure, intergroup contact probably doesn't influence your level of prejudice. So if you have low need for closure, it probably wouldn't matter a lot whether you have intergroup contact or not in terms of whether you're prejudiced. I'm just going based on some previous research. I don't know the specific study, but previous research would suggest that. However, if you are high on need for closure, my guess is that the impact of intergroup contact would be substantial. And your reduction in prejudice due to intergroup contact would be significantly larger than the influence of intergroup contact for people who are low on need for closure. So that's an interaction. So is intergroup contact influential in reducing prejudice? It probably depends on whether you're high or low on need for closure. If you're high on need for closure, it has a lot of impact. If you're low on need for closure, it probably does not. And then another example is an attachment study here. So this is a study done by Simpson and his colleagues. And don't make fun of this drawing. I did this with a simple snippet program where I can draw, but I'm drawing with the pad. I'm drawing with a very small cursor pad. And so this is not my handwriting. This is what I could do on a little, whatever this thing is, 2.5 by 3 inch cursor pad. And so let's just kind of look at this. So this graph, on the graph, always on the vertical axis is the dependent variable. So the dependent variable in this case is support giving. And so what they did in this study is that they brought couples in to a situation, a lab situation, and they stressed the couple out. They did something stressful to them. And in this case, we'll just say that there was a high stressful manipulation versus a low stress manipulation. So stress was high versus low. That was an independent variable. They manipulated that to be a highly stressful situation versus low stress. And half the couples got high, half the couples got low. And then they also measured attachment of the partners. And so just for ease of this presentation, let's just say that they categorize some people as secure. Secure are the people that you want to be in relationships with. They tend to be very emotionally balanced. They tend to give support and accept support with no problem. They tend to be very sensitive and understand their own emotions, and they understand and can read your emotions and respond in appropriate ways, all those good things. Dismissing people are people who are closed off in terms of their emotion. They tend to be very defensive. They tend to derogate their partner or relationship. So relationships are not that important. They might see their partner as stupid or silly or emotional and therefore beneath them. And so this is a predictor variable. And so support giving was the dependent variable. So they were curious about how people would act in terms of giving support to their partner, whether it was a high stress versus low stress situation, but they knew that that would probably be impacted by somebody's attachment style or attachment pattern. And indeed, this is what happened. This is roughly the findings from the study. And so this is a classic crossover interaction where the lines cross over. So we see here with secure people, it's kind of like what we would hope would happen if we were depending on a partner. So this is the support giving by the partner, and this is the person's attachment pattern. And so if the person was secure, they gave less support in low stress situations. So the person might say, hey, are you okay? Is everything fine? And if the partner says, sure, this is no big deal, then the person says, okay, sure, I'm here if you need me, but otherwise, that's it. So there's not a lot of support giving, but they don't need it. High stress situations, secure people give a lot more support. So with more stress, secure people give more support. Dismissing people, sorry about that. That happens occasionally. I think even if I just press my computer a bit, not the keys, it's just on my computer, it will do that. For dismissing people, it's the opposite. Under low stress situations, it's almost too much. It's almost like they're too, oh, is everything fine? I'm here, da, da. but there's no stakes to it because there's low stress. So they give quite a bit of support when it's not needed under this low stress situation. But when you need them and you're under high stress, they disappear. They give a lot less support. So there's two ways of interpreting this, but both interpretations are that support giving related to stress depends on your attachment, or support giving for your attachment depends on the level of stress that you have in the situation. So let's do the stress to attachment pattern. Under high stress, this is how I would interpret. Under high stress, secure people gave more support than dismissing people. While under low stress, dismissing people gave more support than secure people. That's an interaction. So how much support you give under high stress versus low stress depended on what your attachment pattern is. You could flip the interpretation. How much support giving a secure versus dismissing person gives depends on the level of stress. Secure people give more support under conditions of high stress versus low stress, while dismissing people gave more support under low stress conditions versus high stress conditions. So in both those interpretations, the dependent variable in terms of its relationship to one of the variables depends on the level of the other variable. That's an interaction. And this is why people do factorial designs typically, is they are typically curious about interactions between variables in terms of how it impacts the dependent variable. So in your textbook, it talks about different designs, and it talks about this number by number thing. And basically, in most factorial designs, you are combining all levels of one variable with all the levels of another variable. So let's think about a 2 by 2, and we'll talk about this one. So if this was a 2 by 2 design, it just means that both of the IV/PVs have two levels of a variable. So secure is two levels. I'm sorry, attachment is two levels. We have a secure attachment. We have dismissing attachment, two levels of this variable of attachment. Stress, let's just say we have two levels. We have low versus high. That would be a 2 by 2 design. Let's take another example, a 2 by 3. So it's saying that one variable has two levels, the other variable has three levels. So this one for sure has two levels. Attachment has two levels, secure, dismissing. And stress, we could make it into three levels in our design if we wanted to. We could have high, we could have medium, we could have low. That would be a two levels for one variable attachment, and then by three levels of stress. So that's just examples of what they mean by these 2 by 2, 2 by 3, any number by any number. Of course, you don't want to have too many levels to your variables because it becomes a big mess in terms of trying to analyze and interpret and collect your data. From your textbook, this is an example of a 2 by 2 by 2. So this is where there are three independent / predictor variables. So let's look at each of these. So one variable is the gender of the therapist, gender identity of the therapist, and they dichotomize it here, female versus male. There's two levels of gender identity of the therapist, so there's two levels to one variable. There's two levels to another variable. There's psychotherapy type. There's cognitive psychotherapy versus behavioral psychotherapy. Cognitive focuses on your thought patterns, and the idea is that you have maladaptive thinking patterns, and that leads to maladaptive behaviors. Whereas behavioral techniques tend to focus on the behaviors themselves and changing those behaviors without really dwelling on what causes those behaviors. So there's two levels of this. There's cognitive and behavioral. The third variable is length. There's two levels to that, whether you go to therapy for 2 weeks or whether you go to therapy for 2 months. So there's three variables here. Can go in any order because we have all levels everywhere, but let's just say gender identity of a therapist, type of psychotherapy, and the length of therapy. Three variables, and each of them has two levels: female, male, cognitive behavioral, and then 2 weeks versus 2 months. So that's what they're talking about in terms of these designs. The book also goes a little bit over between subjects and within subjects. So just a review, between subjects is if you're randomly assigning people to subgroups. And so if you're randomly assigning people to a therapist that's a male versus female, that's a between subjects design. They also go over within subjects. Within subjects is when everybody gets exposed to all levels of the IV. That happens sometimes in Factorial Designs. So the book goes into this in some detail, but I think if you just remember the basics from before, between subjects is you get one level of the IV only, or PV even, you're at one level, or it's within subjects where you get all levels of the IV, or even a PV could be within subjects. The big thing that they introduce in the chapter that is new to this factorial stuff is what they call mixed factorial design. And sometimes I feel like people use more complicated language than they need to. Basically, mixed factorial design just means that at least one of your predictor or independent variables is between subjects, and at least one of your predictor or independent variables is within subjects. That's all it's saying. So mixed factorial design is a mixture of between subjects and within subjects designs, depending on which variable you're looking at. And let's talk a little bit about interpreting factorial design data. So basically, there are essentially two levels. And let's just stick with the two variables, IVPV variables, and dependent variable. So let's think about the attachment stuff. So we had the attachment pattern and we had the level of stress in the situation, with the support giving being the dependent variable. So there would be two main effects. A main effect is just a simple relationship between one variable and the DV. So in the study we're talking about, there's two main effects. There's a main effect that would say attachment pattern related to support giving. And then there's a second main effect, is the level of stress in the situation related to support giving. Those are main effects. It's just one variable by itself doesn't impact the DV. And then interaction is what we're talking about. That's really the higher level. So we do want to know if there's main effects. Does the variable by itself impact the DV without considering the other variable in the study? And we have two main effects there in that study. So you have as many main effects as you have independent/predictor variables. But then the interaction is often very interesting. So the interaction is, do those two variables work together to impact the DV? And let's just look at that study again. So here, and these are roughly the data that were found in this real study. And so I would say that there is no main effect for stress, because if we look at this, we would average these two lines, and then low stress would be around here in terms of support giving. If we ignored the attachment, it would be around here, be the average. And it probably is sticking here, and it would stick all the way through here. It would be the average between these two lines. The average between those two lines is a straight line. So if there's a straight line here, there would be no impact on support giving from the level of stress because it would just be a straight line. So there would be no main effect for stress. The same thing would happen for attachment patterns. So if we've said, well, are secure people giving more support? Well, if we actually average this whole line together and we ignored stress, it would end up around the middle, right? Because this would go down and this would go up. It'd be in the middle. Same thing for dismissing. If we just ignored the level of stress and averaged their support giving, they're low here, they're high, or I'm sorry, they're high here and they're low here, they'd be right in the middle if we ignored the stress level. So there'd be no main effects here. Both stress alone and attachment alone would not have a main effect in terms of the relationship with support giving. However, when we interpret the interaction, then the interaction is highly significant. So that's the different levels of interpretation. So we have the main effects, and then we also have the interactions. And in your studies, I hope that we're going to be interpreting those types of things. And given that I'm going to be making up your data, it for sure will happen. There'll probably be some interesting interactions to interpret. So I just interpreted that other data, and so here's two other ones, two other studies. Unfortunately, the book has these nice little pictures I can use, but they don't split them, so they throw them in together. I wish they would split them so I could put these in separate slides. These are different studies, but I'm just looking at the study here on top. So it looks like driving performance is a dependent variable, and there's two variables, and I don't know if it's predictor or independent variable. I'm going to guess it might be predictor. So we have time of day, I should say time of day, and then we have daytime, and then we have nighttime. And then we have a second variable. We have people who don't have cell phones and people with cell phones, which this study must have been conducted like 80 years ago. I should say 80, conducted maybe 20 years ago when people didn't have cell phones. Everybody has them nowadays. So if I look at this, I've looked for main effects. I think there's probably a main effect here. It looks like people are better drivers. I'm assuming that higher score means better driving. If we just ignore the cell phone, no cell phone thing, is these things are higher than these. So I'm guessing there's a main effect for day. Day is higher than night if we ignore the cell phone. If we look at just the cell phone stuff, so I'm taking this bar, adding this bar together, I'm taking this bar of cell phone and this bar together. Probably there's a main effect also for cell phone, where people who don't have cell phones, if I take these two blue bars and average them, it looks like it's higher than the average of the, whatever this is, maroon bar for the two cell phones, night and day. So there looks like there's a main effect there for the cell phone condition. And then, is there an interaction? So I'm looking at this, and I'm keeping in mind that there is a main effect for time of day, so these bars are going to be lower anyway. And to me, it looks like there's an interaction. It looks like while there's an effect for people to be poorer drivers at night, there's a bigger drop for people who have cell phones at night. So there seems to be an interaction. So while there is a decrease in driving performance at night, the impact of night on driving performance is much higher for people with cell phones versus those who don't. I'm just looking at the difference between this bar and this bar versus this bar and this bar. Just looking visually, it looks like this difference, if you don't have a cell phone, is smaller than this difference. So it looks like this one has two main effects and an interaction. This is a separate study. So number of symptoms. I'm assuming this is some sort of physiological or physical symptoms. And then we have two variables. We have the length of psychotherapy. So it looks like we have 2 weeks, 4 weeks, 6 weeks, and 8 weeks. And then we have two types. I'm not quite sure what these types are. Type A is a personality type. I'm not sure if that's what they mean, but let's just say that it's a type of personality or a type of disorder, perhaps. It doesn't really matter. I don't care. I just want to interpret the data. And so this looks like, first I want to see if there is a main effect. So is there a main effect for time? It looks like there is. It looks like if we take on average 2 weeks versus 4 weeks versus 6 weeks versus 8 weeks, that there is a decrease in symptoms. I guess it's psychological symptoms over time. So that's a main effect. So if the symptoms decrease over time, ignoring the two types of people, then that's a main effect for time. Let's see if there's a main effect for types. So I'm going to look at this blue line, the type A, and I'm going to guess the average is around here. And guess what? I'm going to look at the type B, and I'm going to look at where the average is. I'm not looking at ignoring the time, just averaging those 4 points. I'm guessing it's around there also. So while there's a main effect for the length of psychotherapy with symptoms going down over more weeks of psychotherapy, it appears to me that the other variable, the type A versus type B, that there is no main effect. Because if I ignore time, if I just average that blue line, it's probably around here, and the average for the red line is around here, I'm guessing also. So it looks like there's no main effect for type. So is there an interaction? So I have to really look at the slope of the lines. Do the slope of the lines change? Looks like it. Looks like we have I don't know if I'd call this a flat line, but it's certainly not a steep declining line. Whereas the line for type A is a much more steep decline. This to me looks like an interaction. It looks like for type B, while there is some reduction in symptoms, it's relatively small, and it doesn't seem to change much between 4 and 8 weeks. There's not much of a change versus somebody who has a type A category. Is the length of time really seems to matter, because you have a pretty big drop here, 2 to 4. Then you have a really big drop, it looks like 4 to 6, and then a drop from 6 to 8. So there's an interaction there. Those lines look like they have different slopes. And it looks like length of time is more impactful for type A people, the blue line, versus people who are type B. So that's an interaction. So one main effect for length of therapy, no main effect for type. And then there's an interaction with A people benefiting from longer psychotherapy versus type B people who don't seem to benefit from the length of therapy itself, at least within that span of 2 to 8 weeks. So your book talks about different types of interactions. There's spreading and crossover interactions. And so the first two are spreading. So spreading is basically when there is, for both groups, there is a similar relationship. And here it's a little bit weird because it's equal. And then this is red is bigger than blue. So definitely there is a spreading interaction here because there is no crossover. I'm sorry about this. There's no crossover here. It's just that there is a consistent relationship, even though this one looks equal. This one is very much spreading. For both of the levels of the variable on the horizontal axis here, which we don't know, but it doesn't really matter. I can still interpret this thing. It's still the same. Whether you're in this area or this area, red is higher than blue on the outcome. You can see that. For both of them, red's higher than blue. But there's probably an interaction here. there's probably an interaction in that this condition, this level, the difference is much higher between those two. Whereas at this level, the difference is much lower. And this is kind of what we were talking about just now. This would be a spreading interaction right here. So no cell phone folks are better drivers than people who have cell phones with them. So that relationship is the same whether it's at day or night, but it's a spreading interaction in that difference is greater at night. That cell phone owners, carriers are more affected negatively by nighttime driving versus those who don't have cell phones. They're impacted, but they're not impacted as much as those who have cell phones. That's a spreading interaction. And a crossover interaction is that there's a flip. That, for example, here, red is higher than blue in this level of this variable on the horizontal axis. However, it flips. So crosses over, it flips, where blue is greater than red in this situation. So it's a flip over. And I have two other examples of that. So I have a spreading and crossover. So I like these data quite a bit. I talk about these data in my developmental classes and actually in my general or introductory psychology classes because I have it in my genetics lecture. And so I'll quickly talk about this study. So this study was conducted in New Zealand and the sample size was substantial. I think 500 or more people, and they were followed from birth. I think at birth they had their genes sampled. I believe it was at birth, but I'd have to double check this. And then they basically followed these same people over at least 25 years of their lives, I believe it was. By the way, this study was done by Ashlom Caspi and Terry Moffat, who last I know was at Duke. And I think they were at Duke Medical School, although Ashlom Caspi is a developmental psychologist and actually got his PhD at Cornell, where I got my master's. I got my PhD at the UC Santa Cruz. So anyway, great researchers. And so these people were followed throughout their lives. And they have a lot of data on them. And so I'll just run through some of the data. And so one of the things that they did is that they have a whole genetic makeup of these people. And so what they did is they were curious about what genetic risks there are to violent behaviors. And essentially there is a gene, and I could look it up for you. If you want to know it, I'll look it up, but I can give you the specific site on the specific gene if you want to know. And this specific site and the specific gene relates to metabolizing MAOA neurotransmitters. So these neurotransmitters typically are things that have to do with regulation of emotion, that type of stuff. And so basically, there are people who have this juncture at their genes that there's a protein at that level that gets processed that helps metabolize these neurotransmitters. And if you're able to metabolize these neurotransmitters, it's been related to less violent behavior. So that's actually these people. So we can just say there's a high metabolizing of MAOA neurotransmitters here. And so you can actually see that they are less violent. And this is consistent with other research. And so research on rats, for example, and on humans. And then people who aren't producing the enzyme that breaks down the MAOA neurotransmitters, they're at higher risk for violence. So there definitely looks like there's a main effect there. This is violence. And so they had different indications of violence, but I'm just using one of their DV, which is whether they were convicted of a violent crime. So they had the police records of these people also. So there is a main effect here for this genetic risk of lacking this enzyme that metabolizes those transmitters. And then the other variable they looked at are the different colors here in the bars. So they had records from basically social workers and things like that about whether there was no maltreatment reported from the parents or from the parents. I think it's not by the parents, but were the parents maltreating the child? No reports of it is green. In pink here, or peach perhaps, there was indications of probable maltreatment. And in red, there's severe maltreatment. And again, the literature also says that maltreated maltreated children tend to become more violent when they're older. Makes sense, right? And so we see there's a main effect here. So if we just ignore the the neurotransmitter stuff, we can see that more maltreatment leads to more violence. So from no to likely or probable to severe, no to probable to severe. So there's two main effects. So the genetic risk for low metabolizing of those neurotransmitters is a risk factor for higher violence. You can see it here. Being maltreated, there's a main effect here also. But we have a spreading interaction. So we have two main effects. And so definitely the low metabolizers are at higher risk versus high metabolizers. And also those who were maltreated are at more risk for violent crimes than people who weren't exposed to maltreatment. There's two main effects there. So those are consistent. There's no crossover interaction here, but there's a spreading interaction. You can pause to see if you can find that spreading interaction, but here's the spreading interaction. So this almost looks like a step. So under the low risk of having a high level of the enzyme that breaks down the MAOA neurotransmitters, that maltreatment is like steps. So you go from no to probable to severe. It's just kind of like a little step. It's very clean. However, for people who are at high genetic risk, the steps look different. They don't even look like steps. We have for the high genetic risk, it's actually really interesting here. I'll get back to this because I always want to talk about this group right here. No maltreatment's really low right here. So even though these folks are at high genetic risk for violent behavior, in the end, they show low violent behavior because of this exposure to a good parenting environment. I know it doesn't say good parenting environment, but I'm inferring that there's probably good parenting environment if there's an absence of maltreatment in this case. However, if there's just any maltreatment, bam, it shoots way up. And even this middle group for the high risk is higher than the severe maltreatment group in the low genetic risk group. And then we have an even higher for severe. So you can see the difference here between the no maltreatment and maltreatment people it's gradual, and certainly there's something there, but it's like little steps. Here it goes from nothing to bam, really high. So this is a spreading interaction. And what's really interesting about this, and this is why I talk about this in my courses, is this illustrates a developmental principle, which is basically that under risky conditions, good process has the most impact. So in this case, we have people who have a high risk genetically for violent behavior, but there was some good processes, good parenting going on here. And that was even more impactful than good parenting for the people at low risk. It had a huge impact. So that good process of good parenting had a huge influence on these kids in risky situations. And we see this in other contexts. And the risk could be anything. The risk could be violent neighborhoods, or the risk could be low SES. The risk, and it could be any risk. There's so much developmental research out there that when kids are in these risky situations, just having some good process really helps. A good process could be various things, but it tends to be there's some adult in their life, and it doesn't have to be a parent. It could be maybe another relative, or it could just be an adult in a neighborhood, or maybe a teacher. If that person takes an interest in the kid and shows them that they care for them and takes time with them, the impact on that kid from a risky context is huge versus the impact it has on kids who aren't from risky contexts. I mean, it's still a good thing. You can see the green is still here, but in this risky context, boy, it makes a huge difference. So that's the more interesting psychological interpretation. The statistical interpretation is that there's a spreading interaction here. There's consistent main effects, higher with more maltreatment, higher with that low level of enzyme to metabolize these neurotransmitters. But even with those main effects differ based on the level of both of them. So even though there's steps here, there's a big difference between no maltreatment and probable for the risky kids. The not at risk kids, it's much smaller differences. And then this is a crossover. So one of our initial examples of the attachment is a classical crossover. There are literally no main effects here. There's no main effect for stress. There's no main effect for attachment. There is simply a crossover interaction, as we discussed earlier. So I just want to show you here that interactions don't need to cross over per se to be interactions. So this is a typical crossover interaction. What you're looking at is different slopes. So they don't have to cross over. So in this case, they meet on the left end, but this definitely is an interaction. So this is an interaction because this variable, I have no idea what the dv and and other variables are. It's just that for this level of this variable that's captured in these two lines, there is a change as this increases. These people, whoever these people are, respond to that difference in the variable captured in the horizontal axis. For people in this line, there's no responsiveness, it's flat. However, this is still an interaction. Is this an interaction? I'm wondering. It's a little bit weaker, but you can see that it does change. The difference between the two lines changes. Here it's more dramatic. I mean, we can all agree. We can see there's a flat line here and it's going up here. And the distance is really quite big as we get here. The distance here is a little bit small. This one, I'm not sure if this would come up to be significant or not. There is a difference because I'm looking at the difference between the squares and the circles. And so as we go down this variable that's captured on the horizontal axis, the difference between those two lines, people in those two groups, changes. So the slope's different. I'm just not sure if the slope is different enough to be a significant interaction. So anyway, the point of this slide is just to tell you that this could actually be considered a crossover interaction, even though they don't cross over. And this one potentially is a crossover interaction also. So interactions are not necessarily things like this little X or like the little attachment thing I told you about earlier. Interactions basically are defined as the slope of the lines are different along the horizontal axis. And I think that's it. So I hope that you found this to be relatively straightforward. I think interactions are fairly straightforward, and so I would recommend that you look at these different graphs and are able to articulate what's happening in the graph to do an interpretation of the interactions, but also you should be able to interpret whether there is a main effect also. And if you have any questions, we are going to have live Q&A sessions this week and next week. So you may join them and ask for clarification of the lecture. Okay, see you later.